The year is 1914. Every European nation is quite upset with each other. They want to attack each other. Russia and France have recently started an alliance. Because of this alliance, Germany faces the prospects of a two-front war if there was to be a war. The British fear Germany's new naval fleet, a threat to their own previous dominant warships. The French want to reclaim territory lost to the Germans in the 1800s. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is on the verge of collapse due to the fragmented ethnic populations not being represented by the monarchy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire form an alliance with Germany. The Belgian, Swiss, Spaniards and Portuguese were trying to avoid taking any sides. Italy, fearing other neighbors, decides to join the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. That takes us to assassination of Franz Ferdinand, that famous spark that ignited the powder keg. But we shouldn't forget that the leaders of Europe at the time were like reckless smokers tossing cigar butts at the base of the powder keg. It just so happened, though, that none of the cigars caused the explosion. To quote Otto von Bismarck speaking to Kaiser Wilhelm II, "I cannot tell you when that explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off." And a foolish thing it was. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled in an open-top car through the hostile city of Sarajevo, published his route. The Archduke was intruding on a national holiday for the Serbs. Franz Ferdinand had survived an assassination attempt, met his fate at the hand of a young Serbian nationalist eating a sandwich in a street-side cafe who watched the Archduke's car travel past. In retaliation, Austria-Hungary makes a litany of demands against Serbia. Serbia meets all but one. But itching to start a fight, Austria-Hungary receives a blank check of support from Germany and declares war against the Serbs. In the east, Russia rushes to the aid of Serbia, declaring war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This will become known as the Eastern Front. To the west, France, in alliance with Russia, attacks Germany. Fingers crossed that a victory will allow them to reclaim its prized region of Alsace-Lotharingen. The French try to recruit the United Kingdom to enter into alliance against the Central Powers, but in the beginning, the British Empire stays on the sidelines. Which is perfect for Germany. Because the Germans have a plan, the Schlieffen Plan. This is the plan by which, in overwhelming strong-handed fashion, the Germans will win the war. According to the Schlieffen Plan, they will send 750,000 troops through Belgium and take over France. Then the German army will regroup their divisions, slide to the Eastern Front, and attack the Russians with the same 750,000 troops. This would be possible because Russia, according to the plan, will take at least 6 weeks to prepare for war while the Germans are conquering France. At the beginning of the war, the Germans stuck to their plan. Problem? The Belgians didn't agree. They said no. The Germans didn't like being told no. So they send the troops in anyways. But those peaceful Belgians? They fought back. They blew up bridges, started fighting back with machine guns and rifle brigades. The United Kingdom, aghast at Germany's bloodthirsty attack against a neutral country, entered the war. So much for the plan. In the meantime, it takes the Russians a whopping 10 days to prepare for war. They apparently didn't get the memo from the Germans. Austria-Hungary offers to fight Russia for the Germans since the Germans were still caught up in Belgium, but that didn't go so well. So, the Germans had to send some of those 750,000 over to the Eastern Front to rescue Austria-Hungary. At this point, it's probably a good idea to bring up the Ottoman Empire. Up until this point, the empire had stayed on the sidelines. The country was divided: should it stay, or should it go? Jumping the gun, hawkish politicians wanting to join the Central Powers directed a portion of the military allegiant to their cause to take their naval destroyers to Crimea and started bombing. The decision was made. The Ottomans were now in the war. As one of the final holdouts, Italy was the target of persuasive rhetoric of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy was part of the Central Powers. Germany was in desperate need of their help to push up through southern France. But Italy, while in agreement about a peacetime alliance with Germany, was not convinced that a wartime partnership would have been as beneficial. Meanwhile, back on the Western Front, the Germans made their way through Belgium, and marched through France en route to Paris. Marshal Joseph Joffre, in charge of the French army, ordered his troops to stop retreating. This leads to the First Battle of the Marne. In an attempt to counter the French defensive push, the Germans inadvertently opened a gap in their line. The French tried to flank the Germans, but the Germans quickly retreated and started digging in. And so we come to the infamous stalemate on the Western Front, which will forever change how wars were fought, including through present day. Historically, wars and military were not thought of as institutions. In fact, the term military didn't even begin to appear until the early 18th century. Instead, for centuries prior, war was considered nothing but a duel. Dueling was thought of to be a more personal conflict, a battle of strength and fight for honor. Kings were expected to lead their own troops into battle, or even battle one-to-one against each other. But by the 1700s, this idea of war was fading. King George II made history as the last king to lead troops to battle, during the War of the Austrian Succession in 1743. As the concepts of chivalry, honor, and classic dueling were removed from the language of war, they were replaced with the institutionalization of war through terms like strategy and tactics. Instead of marching into battle themselves, these armchair warriors surrounded themselves with military leaders to whom they dictated troop deployment and movement, committing monies and lives, without even seeing a battlefield themselves. At the same time as military change to an academic study played out on the battlefield, the Industrial Revolution and technologies brought about a new generation of weapons and artillery. However, even though you might think that leaders would jump upon the opportunity to arm their troops with the latest and greatest weapons, many leaders felt that the adoption of such equipment would represent a loss of honor or would constitute cheating. During the American Civil War, though, certain advances in technology began to alter traditional tactics from previous generations. The development of the rifle in the 1850s began to allow troops far from the front lines to engage the enemy. Likewise, it became necessary for troops to build fortifications to protect themselves from long-range artillery, as distance alone was no longer a defense. The repeating rifle, developed in the later parts of the 1800s, allowed for weapons to fire several shots in succession without the need to reload. The North's domination over production of these new weapons was one reason for their military advancement against the South. Advances in communication, notably the telegraph, allowed Abraham Lincoln to be the first president to instantly communicate with his officers on the battlefield, while the South only used it in a limited sense. This was another great advantage the North held over the Confederacy. The evolution of the military uniform also correlated to a change in understanding how battles were fought. Think back to ancient history. Warfare dominated everyday life. Hand-to-hand combat necessitated protective gear, metal helmets, armor, shields. Through the Middle Ages, heavy armor and protective headgear still dominated. All that changed after the Peace of Westphalia. Instead of being needed for battle, the military uniforms instead changed to be primarily a way to identify the different large, standing armies. Especially during the Napoleonic Wars, fashion and glamour trumped practical and protective. Think about the Pickelhaube, the spiked helmet made famous by the armies of the Kaiser. It was certainly distinctive and ornamental, but the spike served no purpose and the leather material didn't prevent any head injuries. Even footwear was not considered as an important piece of the military uniform. In the US, the military boot consisted of a low-cut shoe worn with gaiters and eventually an ankle-high version, but they served little protection marching through muddy fields or living in soggy trenches. Oh yes, those trenches. Trench warfare is probably one of the most defining characteristics of World War I. While it would be incorrect to say that any one military figure invented trench warfare, historians often point to the Civil War as the first time it was adopted as a strategy on the battlefield. The Petersburg Campaign, which represented a series of battles between the forces of Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, it was 9 long months of trench warfare. After an unsuccessful initial assault on Petersburg by Grant's forces, his troops dug into trenches, lengthening the lines during the numerous raids and battles that followed in the ensuing months. On the opposite side, the Confederates had trouble manning their own trench lines, resulting in gaps of up to 5 feet between men. Due to these differences in manpower and fortification, the Union was able to outlast Lee's armies in supplies, causing Lee to surrender both Richmond and Petersburg, and then surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. Even though it led to Union victory in the United States, popular opinion regarding the use of trenches as a proven military strategy was generally negative. Victory could only come after long periods of time dwindling down an opponent's supplies, while leading to mass slaughter of troops going over the top in the interim. So, what exactly is trench warfare? Simply put, a trench is a dug-in-hole area of dirt, sometimes fortified with wooden planks, allowing for protection for the troops from incoming fire and attack, and representing a place from which troops could safely fire on advancing opponents. Strung together, these trenches formed a trench network. A well-made trench usually was at least 6 to 8 feet deep, allowing for the man to walk upright. The trenches were built in zigzags, curves, or stepwise, minimizing the stretches of straight lines, which could prevent an enemy from firing straight through a trench from one side to the other, killing troops like fish in a barrel. The sides of the trench were fortified with sandbags or wooden planks, with wooden duckboards along the floor to provide for steadier footing and drainage. On the edges of the trenches were parapets, slightly raised sections from which machine guns could be mounted. Digging a trench was an act of manual labor, spade in hand. This is what gave rise to the term digging in. And while trenches could be dug straight from the surface, called entrenching, this would obviously leave soldiers vulnerable to fire while digging. Other methods included sapping, which involves lengthening the trench from inside an existing trench, but only one or two soldiers could be digging at a time, or tunneling, which is like sapping, except that a layer of soil would remain at the surface like a roof, protecting the soldiers until the section was complete and the roof cut away. No matter the method, it was a slow process. The guidelines for the British armies were for 450 men to dig 6 hours a night to cover less than 1,000 feet of trenches. In trench warfare, two opposing sides would dig into their trenches, with the no man's land of anywhere between 50 and 250 yards between them. Sometimes though, the trenches were much closer. Louis Barthez, a French colonel serving in Champagne, noted our 6th Squad went to occupy outpost number 10, which was nothing more than a barrage in an old tunnel trench. 6 meters from our barrage, the Germans had set up their barrage. It was just a few strands of barbed wire between us. You could step across it in 2 or 3 strides. It was all that separated two nations, two races which were wiping each other out. There was even a covered sap which ended a meter from the German sandbags. If you'd stretched out your arms you could have shaken their hands. One side, on the offensive, would prepare a charge with a barrage of artillery shellings. Then, they would try intermittently to rush the other side, traversing over no man's land, oftentimes covered with landmines and barbed wire. In the meantime, defending troops would fire upon the opposition, leading to heavy casualties. Okay, so now back to the war. As you remember, Marshal Joffre had just ordered his French troops to no longer retreat from the advancing Germans. This aggressive stance by the French led the Germans to have to devote more troops to counter the newfound strength of the French troops. This created a break in the German lines, allowing the French to penetrate through the line, which caused the Germans to retreat. Fearful of losing any more ground and suddenly on the defensive, the Germans began to dig. This was the unceremonious end to the ambitious Schlieffen Plan and the beginning of 4 long years of trench warfare. At the time, though, nobody anticipated how long trench warfare would go on. It was thought that the trenches were just a temporary phenomenon, brought upon by the short-term needs in this particular battle. Commanders were sure that with the right maneuvering, traditional warfare could resume. The strategists of the time could just not come to grips with the fact that, like the Pickelhaube, traditional maneuvering and offensive strategies were worthless, futile, and a thing of the past. Those advancements in technology that we discussed? Folks might not have been on board with them, but technology is a one-way train. Long-range firing, rates of fire, and primitive communication systems all contributed to challenges in coordinating offensive attacks. As an alternative, rigid firing schedules and creeping barrages, where attacking infantry positioned themselves closely behind a moving wall of artillery fire, became the key ways to take ground. This highly planned tactic, however, took away control from the frontline commanders, as tactics were left to the pencil pushers and number crunchers back at home. Traditional battlefield maneuvering was to be left behind, and if willing to sacrifice enough men and munitions in the process, the attacking force could continue to advance. From the earliest trenches dug at the Battle of the Marne, the need for evolution of trenches became apparent. Sanitary issues and structural problems plagued the earliest trenches. While good as temporary homes, these trenches were not made for months or years-long habitation. Changes would have to be made to trench structure and strategy if they were to be a winning component of the war. For one, soldiers had never been formally trained in trench warfare or construction. This had to change. During the war, the U.S. military created a course designed to train commanders on how to train their own troops on trench warfare. Trainees practiced on U.S. soil how to dig out different sections of battle line trenches, front line, support, and reserves. They were trained on the use of communication trenches and tunnel systems. Other advanced instruction included marksmanship with the new rifles, grenade practice, and defense against German gas attacks. Finally, the troops were trained on how to survive for weeks at a time in trenches, responsible for their own subsistence. But even with advances in the design and use of the trench warfare system, it is more remembered for its failure to advance the prospects of either side, and more for the intense, bloody, mostly pointless stalemates that led to the loss of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. That brings us to the battles of the Somme and Verdun. By late 1915, the Germans realized that this, in fact, was not going to be a brief war. They realized that their only path to victory was by inflicting mass casualties on the French, eventually wearing them down. Termed Operation Garrigue, the scheme was an attempt, according to General Erich von Falkenhayn, to ensure the forces of France will bleed to death. And instead of a prolonged period of careful firing upon the French, the German forces prepared for an intense, short heavy bombardment to break the front lines prior to attack. In preparation for the attack, France constructed a series of trench lines around Verdun. After initial German success, though, they were rebuffed by the French's defensive preparation and both sides dug in. Again, this was not going to be a short battle. Sensing that they could not maintain their defenses, the French proposed to the British that they launch an offensive against the Dugan Germans along the Somme River, thereby diverting some of the Germans away from Verdun. Because of the French fighting at Verdun, the British forces took the lead in the attack. On the very first day of attack, July 1, 1916, British Field Marshal Haig instructed his troops to charge the Germans. Unfortunately, they were fighting uphill and did not possess enough artillery to destroy the heavy network of trenches that the Germans had developed. July 1st would become known as the bloodiest single day of battle, and Haig would earn the nickname the Butcher of the Somme, as over 57,000 British troops died in a single day. Just like at Verdun, both sides dug in, and another stalemate had begun. The Somme is also known for the entrance of a new vehicle of war, the tank. Although in a very primitive stage, the tank was rolled out by the British for its debut in the Battle of the Somme. Unfortunately, this contribution to the war effort was more mythical than based in reality. Of the 59 British tanks that arrived in France, only 31 ever were functional enough to move into the field of battle, and only 9 tanks would ever cross trench lines. Both battles are known for their mass casualties but not for their victories, for neither side really won either battle. Instead, the Somme left a weakened German army and gave rise to British criticism of the overall war effort. Total casualties: 420,000 British, 200,000 French, and more than 450,000 Germans. A total of more than 300,000 combined troops died. At Verdun, casualties were around 714,231, including the deaths of approximately 143,000 Germans and 162,440 French. As both sides wore down and it became apparent that the only path to victory was attrition and death, the key to winning the war would be which side's troops could last the longest. Developments on the Eastern Front would prove a key pivot point in pushing the Western stalemate to the next step. The Germans had recruited Vladimir Lenin, exiled from Russia, to return to his homeland and begin a revolution. The Russian people were already discontented from the current state of the war and displeased with the Tsar. The ensuing Russian Revolution led to the establishment of the Duma, followed quickly by the overthrow of the White Russian-held government by communist revolutionaries, aka the Reds. The civil war that followed required enough resources devoted to the homeland that the Russians quickly signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Germany and its allies, annexing Ukraine and adjoining portions of land to the Central Powers. This delighted the Germans, as it freed up troops to fight only on the Western Front, providing reinforcements for the beleaguered Dugan soldiers. The Germans were left with only one problem with the remaining war plan: the United States. Up until this point, the U.S. had stayed on the sidelines of the war, as President Wilson had ambitions of swooping in at the eventual end of the war in a role as peace broker, solidifying America's influence on the world stage. However, 2 events occurred that forced Wilson's hand. First, in 1915, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania, a luxury passenger liner, as it traveled through British waters. While the Lusitania did carry a nominal amount of munitions for the British, which was some of the cause for the large explosion, the mass amounts of civilian casualties inflamed the U.S. An apology and promise by the Germans to end this type of submarine warfare temporarily diffused the situation, and it would be 2 more years before the Americans were again prompted to war. This time, the Germans hatched another plan to distract its foes. They attempted to persuade Mexico to, along with troops and supplies from Germany, launch an attack on the southern United States. Known as the Zimmermann Telegram, after the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, this communication was intercepted by the British. Forced to attest to the authenticity of the document, the Germans gave up any illusions as to playing fairly, and resumed their unrestricted submarine warfare against all ships flying the American flag. That was enough for the American people, and enough for President Wilson. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered war. It would be one more year until the American troops arrived in France in full force. Germans realized they had to end the stalemate now, or the fresh US forces would overwhelm them en route to a victory for the Entente. They engaged in risky tactics against the French and British, aggressively attempting to punch through the trench lines. The advances were only temporary though, as the arriving American forces provided the fresh strength necessary to not only halt the Germans, but to begin pushing them back. Now on the run, the Germans knew their days were numbered. Finally, on November 11, 1918, at 11:11 a.m., Germany officially surrendered. The guns went silent and the war was over. Following World War I, military technology rapidly continued to advance. As it became clear that neither quick offensive maneuvering or trench warfare would be successful strategies in the wars to follow, countries raced to make advances in tanks, airplanes, and artillery. The initial use of chemical weapons by the Germans would be countered by the British in an escalating race to research. The interwar period would be defined not by a return to the strategies of old, but by looking out on the horizon to the strategies of tomorrow. Reflecting back on trench warfare, it can be easy to see what a disaster of a strategy it was for both sides. However, it's important to remember the perspective from which the leaders of the time were managing their troops. They had themselves been trained in a time where honor and valor ruled the battlefield, where quick offensive maneuvers designed on the fly by frontline leaders proved decisive. Once they realized, in the heat of combat, that these strategies would not work for this new type of war, there was no time to huddle the troops and invent modern warfare. They had to make do with what they had, mostly the grit, determination, and courage of millions of men. While the price to pay was high, the Entente probably would not have been victorious had it not been for their bravery and fortitude in those Dugan trenches. Shoulder to shoulder for months and years, watching their comrades fall before their eyes, soldiers on both sides knew that it was only their flesh and blood, their resilience, that would keep their side from falling. In the end, honor and glory for the people and homelands of the Entente powers overcame the German army, whose soldiers really just wanted to go home and be done the war. So it is interesting that, in full circle, after 40 million military and civilian casualties, over 4 years after it began, it was a final collapse of morale, not of military, that led to the German surrender. However, the evolution of modern warfare that began during World War I also transformed war to no longer merely a battle between men, but between machines, whose lethality and strength ensured a scale of death and destruction never previously seen in combat.